Good evening to our guests, Pallo Jordan and Prince Dube. Apologies for keeping you waiting, and it's been quite an invigorous discussion happening here. It's, sadly, you're not able to be here in person, but we're grateful that you've made the time, and once again, apologies for keeping you waiting. Okay, so the format we'll follow is that I'll briefly introduce the speakers. We'll then hand over to Prince Dube for a 15-minute presentation on the artist Dumile Feni. That will be followed by a 15 minutes presentation by Pallo Jordan. We'll then have a brief discussion for 15 minutes between the two guests, and we will then follow that with some questions from the audience. So let me just begin briefly with the introductions. Prince Dube is a researcher, artist, and chief curator of the Hector Pieterson Museum. Dube worked as curator at the Johannesburg Art Gallery and the Springs Art Gallery. In 2003, he was selected as a national curator for the South African representation in the 25th Sao Paulo Bienal in Brazil. He curated the Dumile Feni retrospective exhibition in 2005, which I think many of us remember as quite a landmark event, and he edited its accompanying catalogue and subsequently published the monograph Dumile Feni, The Story of a Great Artist, Volume 1, which is envisaged as part of 3 volumes. Zweledinga Pallo Jordan was born in 1942 in Kroonstad, the Free State, and grew up in Cape Town. Active in politics since the age of 7 by selling movement newspapers, he was a member of Cape Peninsula Students' Union and later the Modern Youth Society as a teenager. Jordan joined the African National Congress in 1960 and left South Africa in 1962 while South Africa was under apartheid rule. He was educated at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, USA. Jordan was a member of the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto weSizwe. He served in several roles for the ANC, which was banned in South Africa at the time, in communications and strategy. He served in communications and strategy for the ANC while in exile in London, Luanda, Maputo, and other places. Jordan played a crucial role behind the scenes and was part of the ANC leadership involved in transitional talks. He returned to South Africa in June 1990 after Nelson Mandela's release from prison. Jordan was a minister in several roles for 15 years in South Africa's first democratic government from 1994, including Minister of Arts and Culture from 2004 to 2009. He has published widely and has launched his latest book, co-authored with fellow activist and former Minister Mac Maharaj, which is entitled Breakthrough, published in 2021. That gives insight into discussions around negotiations transitioning between apartheid and the democratic South Africa, in which he played an active part. So I think we have a sense that we have 2 interesting guests. I'd like to hand over at this point to Prince. You have 15 minutes to tell us about your project on Dumile.
But anyway, I'll request the slide. We can control it that side.
Okay.
Yes. Good evening, colleagues. Once more, my name is Prince Dube. I will be doing a presentation on the project I did. That's the making of the, yeah, there you go, of the retrospective, but we'll also give a little bit of the background on the artist himself. Dumile was born in 1942 in Western Cape, in a small town called Worcester. He moved when he was 11 years old to Queenstown, and when he was 15, he moved to Johannesburg. And later he moved to London, and from London he moved to the US, where he died just before returning to South Africa. But I will be focusing only on the South African part, and Minister Jordan will be looking at the other two parts, that is the London and the US parts, where he met him, he saw him work and all that. I did not meet him. I only did the research on his life. As Mario when he was introducing me, mentioned that I'm working on 2 other volumes now. That is volume 2 and volume 3. Volume 2 will look at his life when he was in London, and volume 3 will look at his life when he's in the US. What you have on the screen now are 2 publications. The first one was a catalog, or is a catalog that accompanied the retrospective exhibition that we curated at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. And then the book that I wrote afterwards. Minister Jordan also assisted me with information. I interviewed him for both projects. And it's exciting to mention that he was the guest speaker of the retrospective exhibition when we opened it at the Johannesburg Art Gallery. As I said, Dumile, from Cape Town, he moved to Queenstown. For unknown reason to me, he never mentions these 2 people he met. He will say he moved with his father from Cape Town to Johannesburg. But his father died in Queenstown, and he never came to Johannesburg. He only moved with his stepmother to Johannesburg, where he then started his career in the arts. But interestingly, in Queenstown, it's where he first had an art exhibition in his life at a gallery called Queenstown Art Gallery. But today it has just changed its name. It's no longer Queenstown Art Gallery. His work here in South Africa is mainly influenced by the activity that happened in his life, mainly the death of his mother when he was 6 years old. His mother died while they were staying in Cape Town, and she then became central to most of Dumile Feni's work when he was in South Africa and early years when he was in London. This piece called In Respect of the Dead, the Living and the Unborn. When you look at it without knowing the background that I'm about to give you, you will never understand it. The lady is carrying on the plate 5 embryos. And then you also see those 2 living kids that are sitting on her legs. And then there's another kid that is sitting next to her foot. This is Dumile's mother and what happened to her. The 5 embryos are children that Dumile's mother lost. And the 2 are the 2 that survived. That is Dumile and his sister. And the one next to her foot is the child that passed on when she was giving birth, when Dumile was 6. She had a miscarriage, and she also passed on due to the complications thereafter. So most of Dumile's subjects are mother and child, mother and child, mother and child. And in some that he produced when he was in London, he would inscribe names of people. If you see Betty, you'll know that it's his mother. If you see Grace, that is his stepmother. So in some pieces, those 2 women are integrated in one piece, and you'll see both of them. But in this one in particular that we're talking about, This one, in respect of the dead, the living, is only about his mother and the children that she lost. So from Queenstown, as I said, she then moved to Johannesburg with his stepmother, Grace. And he worked at an art foundry. He was employed there as an artist who will decorate ceramic pots that they produced there. In a way, then, that she also got introduced into art. And that was immediately after he arrived in Johannesburg, after 1957. So between 1957 and 1963, he was employed there. And then after that, then he got to connect with the artists such as Ephraim Gatane, who then introduced him to the mainstream art. For instance, immediately after he was introduced to the mainstream, he managed to have a solo exhibition at the Durban Art Gallery. This is where the photograph on your left was taken during that exhibition in 1966. And then this is the style, the middle photograph, the middle image, sorry, is showing the style that he has moved into immediately after he started doing, I will say, after he had met Ephraim Gatane, he got his own identity and painted or did drawings that will be up to this day Dumile, that will identify him. There's another one, the untitled piece. Can we have this next slide? Okay, this is Dumile. This is the style that Dumile, we know him of. He says that these pieces, these works that are unfinished or that he did not complete, they were emotionally, they were inspired by emotions. And when he was doing them, the emotions will be so strong that he will eventually not be able to complete the work and just throw it away immediately. But later, when he moved to the US, then he was able to surpass that and focus on a piece and work on it until he completes it. But most of the works that were done in South Africa, will find them in particularly following this style. And the emotions that he carried with from the passing of the parents, the mother and his father while he was still young, he carried them with him, and whenever he produced work, the thoughts will always be with him. As you see, the one on your left, there are some graves there. And if you go to Queenstown, there is a graveyard where his father is buried. It's very close to the houses there in the township, Gwamlungis. You just cross one street and then we are in the graveyard. So, as I'm saying, that those emotions are reflected in almost all the works that he produced while he was in South Africa. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes, these ones that he produced, you can see even the dates, 1964. This is when he was influenced by the works of artists such as Gerard Sekoto. You can see most of, the Sekoto is appearing in some, especially the one with houses. This is what's before he took his own signature, or he established his own signature, or his own style. Here he was still influenced by the artists that he met through Ephraim Gatani in Johannesburg. Can we move to the next one, please? Okay, these are signature pieces that I'm talking about. The content of the work is not so easy to understand because they are linked to specific events that took place in his life. Unfortunately, this one, I do not have a background on what was happening while did he had to paint this table turning house. This was also in 1967, sorry. So after 1964, we see the Dumile that we know until 1991, where he produces works which are in a way very complicated to understand, and they are emotional. Can we go to the next one, please? Yes, the speaker before me mentioned something that influenced the texture of the images. If you're looking at the going of the 1966, you see the texture that you see in the background of the drawing. This was not intentional. This was influenced, or this happened when you rub charcoal on a piece of paper stuck on the wall in those 4-room houses. So this is the roughness that will be created by the surface of the wall. It's not necessarily that he intended to create a drawing like that, but the environment contributed to the final piece. Then we also have the African Guernica on your right-hand side, which became one of his popular works, especially before we did the retrospective exhibition. This was one of his signature pieces. He was known mainly for this particular piece.
Prince, I'm sorry to cut in, but if you want to maybe just focus on any key points that you still want to make, because
okay,
yeah.
All right, maybe we can move forward a little bit. Okay, this is the same example. These are, yes, let's move further. Okay, yeah, here are sculptures that he created, and these are some of the charcoal drawings. Yes, let's move again. Let's move further. Let's move again. Okay, a little bit. Now, if you go back up a little bit. If you take your mind back to the examples that I've just presented and compare with these pieces that we're looking at now, you can see the major changes in the style. The first one on your left, which says Untitled, was the first drawings he created when he arrived in London. So the style changed completely, and you can see that you no longer see those drawings with lines which are showing some kind of fear, or I would say they are now solid and straightforward, as if the environment that he is in now brings some little bit of peace within his mind. All of them, 2 of them were done in the UK, and the last 2 were done, I mean, the middle one was done in the US, the last one was also done in the UK. After he moved, I mean, after he left South Africa, the style changed completely. And it's very easy to identify his work, even if you don't know the dates, to tell which one, this one was done in the US, or this one was done in the UK, or this one was done in South Africa. So scholars who would like to study Dumile, I think they will find it very simple to identify the pieces that might come up during their research. Can you move to the next one, please? Okay. This is same subject matter, but you can see the changes. You can see the solidness of the line on the right, on the red piece, which was done when he was in exile, and the other one that was done while he was in South Africa. You can see that the pen or the strokes have that kind of emotion that I was talking about. It's like a person who's living under fear or who's completely not happy with the environment that he was in. And then immediately when he moved to London, things changed. Can you move to the next one? Okay. Here then are the covers of the books that we work on. The first one is out already, it's volume 1. It covers his life and work from 1942 and 1968 while he was in South Africa. And then the second one is no longer, it's not yet published, but it's coming up. It covers his life when he was in the UK from 1968 to 1978. And the final one will cover his life when he was in the US from 1978 to 1991 when he passed on. Then can we move to the next slide? Which I think is when I say thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you very much, Prince. I think some of us have been wondering whether, where you were on this project, because as I mentioned earlier, the retrospective really was a huge event. For many of us, we had never seen a critical mass of Dumile's drawings. We'd seen single examples here and there, and suddenly there was just so many works. And you've been a little quiet, maybe for those of us who haven't been, in direct contact with you. So it's good to hear that your project is continuing. Pallo, I believe you're going to pick up the story and reflect on your experience and perspectives of Dumile.
Yes, thank you very much, and good evening. I met Dumile when he arrived in London and knew him more as Dumile the sculptor. But of course, as we can see from the retrospective that Prince Dube has presented us with, Dumile was also a very prolific pen and ink artist. What used to amaze one about him was the casualness with which he worked, almost as if while he was sitting and talking or doing whatever with Dumile, he'd have a sketch pad next to him or a piece of paper next to him, and he'd have either his red ink pen or black ink pen, and you'd see his hand moving, and he'd conduct a conversation, and at the end of it, there'll be something, a product. The casualness was fortunate and unfortunate. Fortunate in that what was going on in his mind, things he was reflecting on, he reproduced on paper. Unfortunate because he tended not to preserve his work or seemed not to value it much. He just leave that scratch pad behind in a pub, on your dining room table, in your lounge, or wherever he was. One thing that one noted from the very beginning about Dumile and his work was his assertion of a very strong African identity. A friend of mine, a fellow South African, a musician, the late Harry Miller, looking at one of these casually produced sketches of Dubile's, remarked that this man has an amazing notion of the human physiology, and he has an amazing understanding of human anatomy. The lines in Dumile's work produced in London are always extremely strong. That was reflected also in his sculpture. While in London, Dumile moved in a circle of South Africans, exiles, mainly the artists and musicians who were then resident in London. And his home, or wherever he stayed or lived, was always marked by what he produced. He worked in clay, of course, in the beginning, which was then cast and then reproduced in bronze or whatever other metal that he fancied. And had he been a little bit more, I suppose, rigorous in the way he treated his artwork, we would have by now, a gallery full of the sculptures he produced while in London and after he moved to New York. He was fortunate in that one of the big galleries in London recognized his talent very early, and they used to exhibit and market his work. It was through that gallery that he encountered the actor Anthony Quinn, who saw one of Dubile's ink drawings in the gallery and asked the gallery owner, "Who is that?" And the guy says, "No, it's a South African artist by the name of Dumile Feni." He says, "Wow, I want that man to do a bust of me." And if you are familiar with the features of Anthony Quinn and you look at Dumile's sculptures, I think you can very easily understand why Quinn was attracted to that particular artist, because Anthony Quinn's features are also very, very striking and very strong. And he thought that this was the person who could actually capture his character in the form of a sculpture. As a person, Dumile was a mixture of his experience in South Africa. One was aware of where he was born here in the Western Cape, but he never spoke about his time in Queenstown, where he spent a number of years in a hospital, because even as a young person, he had a problem with his lungs. And it was while in hospital that he began doing his artwork. When he moved to Johannesburg, by the time he moved to Johannesburg and then met other artists there, it was, I suppose, the moment when it was possible for him to take off. Emotion and emotion-ridden is what one can always say about Dubile's work. And when you spoke to him about it, he would either say, "Well, look at it, it speaks for itself," or he tried to explain it in terms that I suppose he felt and what he wanted to convey. African Guernica, which one did not see in London, but one had seen copies of. When I asked him about it, he said, yes, the real Guernica was an event which took place in the middle of a war on one day. And he says, if you look at my African Guernica, is talking about what is happening in what is called peacetime, and it's happening every day. And he said, think about that. And when you think about that, you realize what a powerful statement that African Guernica really is. That was equally true of many of the other works that he produced while he was in exile. He moved from pen and ink and began using watercolors here and there, as you saw from the retrospective. The watercolors that he began using, he explained in terms of a gentleness that he wanted to introduce into the work he was producing at that time. The more prominent ones I remember were those he produced for an album that Huma Sekela recorded while in London, and they were used for the record cover and for the inside pages of the record album when it was finally produced. Another side of Dumile was how much faith and confidence he placed in his own experience, which was not much wider than that of the average Black South African of our generation. And he had a tendency of adopting an attitude of, don't confuse me with facts. I know what I know what I feel. And sometimes he did not know. When you tried to give him the facts, he'd find it very, very resistant. While in London, I suppose as an aspect of his developing personality and exploration of the world, he turned towards a number of religious doctrines. He was very, very concerned, I think because of his experience, about his place and humanity's place in the universe. He thought he had found some of these answers in Zen Buddhism, and he was very, very attracted to the Zen and in Japanese culture. He explored aspects of Japanese culture in the form of karate and other martial arts as well. And as a result of that, he earned the nickname during the latter part of his stay in London of Samurai. And where by the time he left to go to the United States, many of his old friends referred to him as Samurai. Inevitably, when he was in the United States, he linked up with a number of Japanese artists and with a number of students at the New York University, many of them from the Far East. I think one of his favorite girlfriends was a woman from the Philippines. He enjoyed drinking his sake, and he was a prolific sculptor during those years. It's one of the great pities that Dumile was so casual about his work. Visiting his gallery, I think the year must have been 1982, New York. And there was an array of sculptures already cast in brass all over the room. And one thought, well, yeah, the man has now become a great success. But it didn't reflect itself either his lifestyle or in his income. To this day, it's one of the things I mourn, that we didn't make a greater effort as South Africans to try and preserve a lot of that work. In the manner in which he lived, Dumile was very much, I suppose, the bohemian artist. When he was broke, he was broke. And when he had money, he had money. And he was extremely generous with his friends when he was flush. At the same time, too, when he was broke, he was always, I think, a little too proud to approach friends and others for assistance. There was a time when he was staying in a flat in Brooklyn during the middle of a New York winter. And he said he was going to hibernate like a bear during that winter because he couldn't afford the heating. You can imagine how ridiculous that was. And what sort of havoc that played also with his physical health. I found it interesting. I found it also a little ironic, but also typical of him that he passed on in the way that he did. He was living in Brooklyn at the time, and there was a record shop. Well, it was a huge supermarket actually, called Tower Records. On Broadway and 59th Street. Dumile was on the bus going uptown to Harlem, and I suppose there was some piece of music that he always wanted to hear. He noticed the record shop. He alighted from the bus, walked into Tower Records, and as many of us do, was leafing through the vinyl racks. And it was there that he got a heart attack and passed on. Music had also been a very big part of his life in London. When he worked, it was almost sometimes as if the muse had possessed him, and his body would shake, and he'd say, why don't you put on a Ray Charles record? Why don't you put on this or that? Because he needed the music, I suppose, in a way to becalm himself and maybe to control the muse which seemed to possess him at that time. His friendship with the musicians, especially those of the band that left here as the Blue Notes, Chris McGregor, Dudu Pukwana, Mongezi Feza, Louis Muhulu, Johnny Gianni, I suppose is legendary. His relationship with other musicians, like Huma Sekela also, in his flat he stayed for some time in Brooklyn, I think is also well known. Dumile was, I think, what can be referred to as a very self-conscious advocate of Black consciousness, long before that notion had taken root amongst Black intellectuals in South Africa. And that Black consciousness, I think, is reflected in his work. Virtually all his themes are African and reflect the life and the experience of the African people here in South Africa. I tried to get him to illustrate a collection of African folk tales that my late father had compiled. But in his usual manner, Dumile sort of half completed that work. And I think part of the reason was the distance, the physical distance between South Africa and London. And also, I think the emotional distance between what the African folk tales reflected and his own experience. Nonetheless, the pen and ink work is quite striking and unmistakably Dumile Feni's work. Our own friendship revolved mainly around political activity. As has been mentioned, I played a central role as an activist in the ANC, especially in the area of communications. So we not so much persuaded, but I remember during the huge demonstrations that we mobilized in London after the Soweto massacre in 1976, Dumile sort of requested a bed sheet. Said, give me a white bed sheet. And he produced a huge banner for that demonstration. Interestingly, it had the strong lines, but also he used a lot of watercolors in that particular banner. I never did ask him to explain what he tried to project there, but it was a statement, a very strong political statement. In New York, his work, he linked up with a group of, as I said, Asian artists, but also the number of African-American political activists. Fortunate and unfortunate, because when he passed on, much of the work he had produced in New York disappeared into the hands of his friends and acquaintances there. And that has been a great loss to South African arts. I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Pallo. I didn't want to cut in because it's, it's very interesting for us to actually hear these quite wide-ranging observations about Dumile. In terms of the format, we'd like the two of you to just engage in discussion for 15 minutes. There may be things you want to respond to directly from the other person's input, but I'm also going to just plant something here that I'd be interested to see how you both respond to. I'm struck by, on one hand, for me, in terms of Dumile, one of the big challenges is this question of interpretation, of trying to find meaning in his work, and the fact that Pallo, as you said, he felt that the work was actually speaking for itself. And there seems to be a very different orientation and approach between Prince, who's seeing the work as strongly autobiographical, and with a lot of emphasis on the loss of his mother. And Pallo, you made two interesting comments about he depicted what was on his mind, and you also spoke about reflecting the experience of Black South Africans. That suggests to me a much wider range of themes, although I'm also aware that many artists operate on simultaneously on different levels. There can be elements that can be interpreted in terms of their personal experience, and other levels at which the work actually resonates more broadly. So I'd be interested in just hearing both of your responses to that question of, do we overplay the biographical? How important really is the biographical in terms of an understanding of Dumile? But on the other hand, I've sort of, abused my position here by putting that question to you. If there are other points that you feel you would rather be responding to from the other presentation, please go ahead. Prince, can I ask you to start? We can't hear you. You're on
Hello,
mute.
I'm back.
You're back. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. If you look at it, if the biographical part was complicated for analysts or for people who are faced with Dumile's work. So with other background, for instance, a political one, it might be easy to attach a subject to a certain event, a political event, because you are aware of. But Dumile kept his life a bit closed. It did not share what happened to him with many people. So if you look at the books, for instance, as I said earlier, the books don't talk about him in Queenstown. They will always talk about him coming to Joburg with his father, which is something that never happened. I've listened to interviews where he was interviewed, for instance, in the US. Some of the stories that he told the public then were completely made up. They were not the real thing that happened to him. And I don't know why did he want to hide his background to most of the people. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I think the autobiographical dimension of Dumile's work is very, very significant. And it has to do with that wrestling about human identity, his place in the universe, the place of humanity in the universe. Experientially, Dumile's life is very close to that of many of his generation. That very powerful black and white pen drawing of his mother with the lost children, the stillborn child. Very, very powerful statement, but not unusual. Being unwell and being in hospital and acquiring a skill or discovering a skill like art, moving to Johannesburg, again, that's not untypical as well. Now, I think Prince is very right when he says Dumile concealed or did not volunteer a lot about his own personal life experience. It would come out in little drips and drabs in conversation. And it would come out sometimes when you looked at his artwork. It would come out in casual comments he'd make about this or that event. But it wasn't as if, you'd sit with Dumile and, as many of us used to do in those days, say, you know what happened, and we'd go into a long story about maybe your days in high school, your days doing this, your days doing that or the other. Never like that. So in that respect, he was very, very private. But his concern with humanity's place in the universe and the pain experiential in his case, and then the pain experienced by the people he came from and the country in which he was born is unmistakable, I think, in much of his work.
Okay. Thank you. I do have a few other things here, but I'm just going to allow you the option if there's anything you want to respond to directly to each other's presentations. Otherwise, I can pose, I have more questions than we have time. Should I jump in? I think, Gavin Junch is the artist and curator who was also a friend of Dumile. He alerted me to the thought that, really Dumile aspired primarily to be a sculptor. And I think, Pallo, you also alluded to that. And he also argued that the way that we see the space in Dumile, especially the later drawings, the lines overlapping, etc., his point of view, I hope I'm not misrepresenting it, was that, Dumile was visualizing a sculpture. And I wonder to what extent that might not have something to do with the comment you made, Pallo, about his casualness about the object. Because, was that just part of a sort of conceptual or performative process towards something else that perhaps never actually happened? The drawing was just a means towards that. To what extent was he thinking beyond the drawing, and the drawing just being the accessible medium? And I'm just going to complicate my point a little further, which is that, with Dumile, just correct me, but I understand that he was about to embark on a new chapter. He was trying to register. He had ambitions to make film, and film is also another medium. And if you think about Dumile turning the page over, if you think about the scroll that he did, all these things are not conventional in terms of if you're doing a drawing or you're doing a painting. So to what extent was he thinking in other art forms, and that the drawing was just almost part of the process of trying to attain something that actually didn't actually ever happen or may not have happened? How important are his intentions to be a sculptor and a filmmaker for how we should look at his drawings?
Well, you're probably right. With respect to that, there is a piece of work of Dumile's which is on canvas, and it unrolls like a reel of film. I've never seen it myself, but I've heard lots of people talk about it. While he was in New York, he did register at the New York University School of Film. His work as a sculptor, yes, and that is how I knew him as a sculptor. So perhaps you are right in saying that the pen and ink was perhaps just conceptualizing a sculpture which he would then later execute. The sad thing about the casualness of Dumile is that many of the sculptures that he did produce, especially in London, amazing, powerful work, he just sort of left it. He stayed with a friend of mine, Vijay Rama, now late, in St. John's Wood in London. And on the veranda of Vijay's flat, Dumile executed 3 busts, about 3 to 4 feet high, perhaps even higher, in clay. Very powerful work. And when he left for the United States, he just left them there. Vijay and others felt that this work had to be preserved somehow. But being clay and the size, it was impossible to move them. And they were just left there, and presumably over time were weathered by the rain and disappeared. The same sort of thing happened also in the instance of one of his first studios in London, where he produced very, very huge sculptures in clay. Perhaps never get a chance to have them cast and then transformed into bronze. And well, circumstances being what they were, he would just move on and they'd be left behind. Same sort of thing seemed to happen in New York. But I think in New York, he was much more fortunate in that a lot of his work, they did get cast into bronze. And what's happened there is that a lot of it has been lost. The exploration of the human anatomy, especially the facial features in his bronzes, and in many of his sculptures, clay ones especially, quite amazing. And it's a pity, it's a great pity actually, that one didn't have the presence of mind then, even just to photograph them as they were being executed. Because the three that were left on VJ's veranda, I think were amazing in and of themselves. But being Dubes, when he moved on, he moved on. And that was that, and they lost forever now.
Okay, Prince, do you want Prince,
Yes,
do you want to come in on this?
Yes, Mario. I'm not sure if we want to tie him to being a sculptor only. As you mentioned, he also did films. And I've seen one of them. It's a very powerful film. Some of them were not done. Like there's one that he wanted to do on the release of Nelson Mandela, but there are some drawings that he did before. You also have sculptures, you have drawings. It's a balanced production. He's done drawings, he's done paintings, he's done sculptures and movies. So he's a fully fledged artist, I would say, who hasn't taken one route to say, I'm a sculptor, I'm a painter, or I'm a musician, or I'm a filmmaker. He's done all of that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point we can take a few questions from the audience. Do we have anybody who wants to pose anything to our guests? Raphael there, Riason. Sorry, what about this? The microphone is not working. Could somebody please help Riason? Okay, we have a question from Raphael Chikukwa from the Zimbabwe National Gallery.
Okay, thank you. My question is to the Honorable Minister Pallo Jordan. Was it deliberate for most of the exiled political artists and other activists not to identify themselves, like what Dumile Feni could not really identify himself when he was in New York?
No, Dumile identified himself very strongly with the struggle for liberation. If you travel south on the West Side Highway in New York, when you reach just below 14th Street, there's a wall that you'll encounter very reminiscent of the work of the Mexican muralists, which depicts a number of revolutionary figures. Amongst them is a figure of Nelson Mandela, arms folded, executed by Dumile Feni. And as he explained, that he introduced color both for emotional purposes and also as a means of conveying certain emotions like warmth, etc. So Dumile identified very strongly with the struggle, identified specifically with the African National Congress, and regarded himself very much as a militant of that movement.
We want to go ahead, please.
Bonjour, moi je vais parler en français parce que je ne parle pas anglais. Donc je suis française, je ne suis jamais allée en Afrique et mes deux parents sont morts à peu près au même âge que lui et je suis psychiatre d'enfants, il y a certainement un lien. Et j'ai vu donc beaucoup de dessins d'enfants et je fais aussi partie d'une famille où il y a plusieurs peintres. Et je pense que le monsieur qui a parlé en premier a raison, les traits sont imprégnés de sentiments de deuil tout le temps, hein. Qu'il soit à Londres ou en Afrique, enfin tout ce qu'il a montré, on voit que le sentiment de deuil est toujours là. Et bon, certainement il a un style africain, c'est bien normal, hein, mais c'est quelque chose qui le poursuit. Et certainement, c'est sa manière de parler son intime qui est en amont du langage. Et là, voilà, ça le renvoie à quelque chose de certainement très profond, archaïque, et qui a imprégné sa vie et qui l'a dirigé, enfin, d'une certaine manière.
Would that have been translated, or do we need to be translated for?
Yes, it was more a comment. Sorry, I didn't get all of it, but a comment that the lady who spoke also had similar experiences to Dumile growing up in terms of with parents and am I on the right track? Yeah. Yeah, maybe. Hang on.
Just hold on, please. We're getting a translation.
Sorry, she was saying that she can see the grief in his pen work, whether it's the work that he did in London or the work before. I guess she is a psychiatrist with children, and she looks at a lot of children's drawings that deal with grief, and so she sees the grief in the penmanship.
Okay, so that was more of a comment. Do we have any more questions? Okay, I think to close, I'm going to just pose a small question to Prince, because I think we all wish him every success with his project. It's a very important project. I think that there's still a lot that isn't known about Dumile, and I think particularly for South Africans, the exile years are still quite a blur. But the question I have for you, Prince, is that there's a general prejudice against the work done in exile from South African art historians who feel that, and it doesn't just apply to Dumile, the same comments are made of Soweto, that, you know, they become disconnected from their life in South Africa and the work becomes a bit of a shadow. So I want to ask you personally, as someone who's going to pursue this project, do you have that view, or do you have another view on the work done in exile? Because I would think that would be very important, particularly if you're going to devote special editions, you know, to the UK and to the US.
Yeah, that is influenced by collectors. So people who have collected the South African period, collected a lot of his work, they will say then that is important. That is an important period, and that view has then been spread to historians to say this period is not important because people are just protecting their investment. But on my perspective, all the years, the time in South Africa, time in Europe, time in America, they are all exciting for me as a researcher and a writer and a historian. They carry different substance. The London period is very exciting if you look at the changes that took place. And the US as well, the developments moving into film and the sculptures that he produced, the history, one of them was reproduced for the Constitutional Court. those pieces, they have their substance, which is different from the pieces that I showed earlier on, which he produced while he was in South Africa.
Okay, I think at this point I would just like to thank you both for your time. Pallo, you want to come in on this? Sorry.
If I could.
Yes, please.
I think perhaps the art historians miss the point because the man person, Dumile was touched South Africa all the years he was in exile. There was a lot of movement between South Africa and London, between New York and London. And he kept abreast of what was happening. He was also, of course, very conscious of the wider African world beyond South Africa as well, which he tried to integrate into his work. I think the art historians need to look at the biographical dimensions a little bit more.
Well, thank you for that. I must say I'm cheered up by that, because I do find the work done in exile equally interesting. And I often have minor arguments or skirmishes with friends of mine about this point. So thank you very much for the time. Apologies again for having kept you waiting. And of course, Prince, good luck with your very important project. I think we all really look forward to getting hold of those books and seeing the fuller story. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Enjoy your evening.